about the potential for international students to increase the number of work hours, I'd like to ask Catherine and Miriam if they, do they think this is going to happen, students increasing their work hours, and what makes you think that will happen? So, Catherine.
Thanks, Margaret. And I just, like the other panelists, I would like to thank the BMRC for holding this really important discussion. Also, it's a pleasure to join the rest of you. It's always great to be on a panel like this, if for no other reason than to hear what everyone else has to say. So it's great to be here. Also, I notice my camera keeps freezing, so we'll just cross fingers that if I freeze, it's in a very lovely position. In terms of how many students will increase their work hours, I think it's really difficult to say. I don't think we have enough information to really know what's going to happen. What we do know is the share of international students who are working during study has grown significantly since 2000. There were policy changes in 2014 that made it easier for international students to get a work permit, and that does appear to have contributed to an increase in the number of international students who are working. So in 2018, which now of course is a little bit old, but in 2018, 5 out of 10 international students had T4 earnings. So we know a lot of students are working. But what we don't really know is how many hours they're working now. And there's kind of 2 reasons for this. One of them is the administrative data that we usually use to capture things about kind of earnings and income don't capture working hours. So the IMDb may allow us to observe something like an increase in annual income of international students, which could suggest that they're working more hours. But there could also be other factors that are contributing to changes in income that we see through the IMDb. The other reason it's a little bit hard to know how much students are working and how much we'll be able to measure the impact of the change is, I think, what other panelists have already alluded to, which is that there's a gap between what's captured in the tax records and what's actually happening. So, as we've all talked about already, we know that some students have already been working more than 20 hours, with some or all of those hours being in the informal economy. And so the policy change could have a couple of different effects. It could affect how many students are working, those kind of 30 and 40 hours, but it could also change how many students are actually working those 30 or 40 hours in the formal economy and having that being reported for tax purposes. I think the best way we're going to know the impact of the changes in the short term is probably going to be through anecdotal evidence that we get through like international student associations, international student advocacy groups, international student offices at particular institutions are likely the ones to be hearing kind of the feedback about how international students are responding. If we want a more comprehensive understanding, then maybe one of the best ways to understand it could be through something like the Canadian Bureau of International Education, if they would choose to include questions about this policy change in their next international student survey. So in short, a satisfying answer, I think it's hard to guess. I think it's likely that students will increase their working hours, but how many students and how many hours? I think it's going to be hard to know, and it's going to be a space that we're all going to be watching for sure.
Great, thank you, Catherine. And Miriam.
I was on mute, sorry. Thanks for inviting me to this panel to speak on this. I think to some degree it'll depend on what comes with this change. I saw in the press release that it's a temporary change. It's a pilot that is not intended to last, or maybe will be renewed depending on the outcomes, or like you said, the unintended consequences. How many will take up this offer, or how many will increase their work hours, will depend on some factors, because international students who come to study here, I see them in 2 categories: those whose families can afford to pay their tuitions and send them enough to survive and pay the tuition and pay rent and all of that, and there are those who can't, and so they rely on work, and that's why they work part-time hours and change it to full-time during the holidays, like the law allowed it before the change. So where I see an increase possible is in the second category, that can't rely on their family to support them in paying their cost of living, basically. Because it's a temporary thing, if it might kind of allude to the international students that this is probably something to fix a shortage in labor market. We don't have workers. We're trying to get workers in all streams of immigration. But it would be encouraging for international students, no matter what their financial situation is, to take on more hours if this comes with, for example, smoother pathways to PR after they finish their international student, their post-secondary education. So it really depends on the details of what this entails. You take on more hours, you don't worry about having to find full-time employment, especially if you're working in your field as international student. And then what? Are you able to stay in that job? Will you get PR as soon as you graduate? That will help the students decide whether to increase their hours or not. And yeah, I think that's the category that we will see. It's hard to decide what the numbers are unless we have stats about, like, we know 600,000 in the country are international students right now. We don't know how many really rely on their jobs to pay for their costs. So that's what it will depend on. So it's hard to put a number on it.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And so our next question we'd like to ask